Hello friends, it is time for a nonfiction November wrap-up video. I read 4 books for nonfiction November, and I would say that it was a really great nonfiction November. I am not usually a nonfiction reader, and it takes a lot to get me interested in a nonfiction read. And this year, I think that I probably hit about 75%, we'll say, as a um, good reading month for me. Out of the 4 books, I really enjoyed 3 of them. One of them was really interesting, but it was very dense. So let's get into my wrap up. The first book that I read in the month of November was How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. And I absolutely adored this book. Ruth Goodman is apparently a historian who has worked for the Victoria and Albert Museum, among other things, and she was on a BBC program for a while where she lived as a Victorian on a Victorian recreation farm, I guess. So I have not watched that series yet, but I plan to because this book was so interesting, so conversational. It gave a lot of very interesting facts, but it was told in a way that was kind of like a story, like you were just watching a day in the life of a Victorian, more like lower middle class, like working people type Victorians. It literally went from the time that a Victorian person got up in the morning to the time that they went to bed at night. And with a smattering of like what a day outside of the house would have been like, kind of a thing. It talked about what a working day was like for Victorian men and women and children. Talked about Victorian parenting, which was kind of, I mean, it was funny, but it was also like kind of like, oh my gosh, I can imagine why people had such short lifespans back then. Um, and then, it talked about leisure time, which, working class Victorians didn't have a great deal of. But talked about sports in Victorian times and what Victorian boys were allowed to do as opposed to what Victorian girls were allowed to do, and kind of the thought processes behind those ideas, which a lot of them were like more based in, not that like girls shouldn't do those things, but it was like they honestly thought that girls um, weren't like physically like made to endure the things that men or little boys could endure. So it was just very interesting, and I can see this is a library copy, but I may try to get my own copy of this if I can find it, like at a used bookstore, because it's just something that I feel like I would really like to reference here and there, especially when I'm reading for like Victober. That's why I picked this book up, because I still had like the Victober vibes going, and I wanted to keep it going a little longer. But so this is a great companion to any Victorian novel that you'll ever read. The next book that I read, I no longer have the physical copy of because I lent it to my friend Marcia, and it is called Beatrix Potter: A Life in Nature by Linda Lear. And I ended up actually listening to this on Scribd, on an audiobook version, but it was kind of nice to have the physical book and the audiobook version, because there were a lot of great illustrations and photos of Beatrix Potter and her illustrations and manuscripts and things in there. So that was really interesting, that you wouldn't have gotten if you just listened exclusively to the audiobook. But I will say, because this book was so big, it was nice to listen to it on an audiobook form. The narrator was okay. She was not, the best narrator I've ever heard, but she was decent. And Beatrix Potter was just such an interesting woman. She was basically in the Victorian era for, most of her young life, and she spent most of her life as a single woman, and which was probably unheard of in those days. But she did end up getting married later in life. But she was just like such an entrepreneur, and she was very scientific. She loved nature, loved science. She even helped develop some different, uh, I don't want to say penicillin, but she helped to come up with some ideas that helped in future developments of some medicines and things. She was a sheep farmer. She just like she bought all kinds of land that's now, I guess, in the National Trust in England. Man, she led a very full life and did it mostly on her own, which was, great to see in an era where, women were mostly subject to men. She, had to prove herself a lot to the men in her life, but, uh, they, they ended up really respecting her, I think, and knowing what she could do. And if they didn't trust what she could do, she showed them what she could do. So Beatrix Potter, she was not just a children's book author, which, is awesome in itself, but she did a lot of things, and wow, I could only imagine doing half of what she did. The next book I read was another, this was actually an autobiography of Julia Child, My Life in France. And I found this at a library book sale back at the beginning of the year, and I knew right away that I was going to save this for Nonfiction November. And yeah, it was so just endearing. She made me want to cook more French food, and I did that. I made beef bourguignon, and I did a video, so I'll leave that in the link down below. But it was very tasty. Did good job, Julia Child. Made a good recipe. And she just her writing is just beautiful. I felt like it was a little heavy-handed on the love of France, but that may just be my own experience in France coming through. I did not have a lovely experience there. I mean, I'm not going to say that, France is horrible because I didn't have a good experience, but I felt like she could never understand anybody not liking France, and it just seemed like France was just, they could do no wrong, and that was a little bit like, whoa, really, Julia? Like, let's get some reality in here. but her writing, her love of France obviously came through really beautifully in this. Her love of cooking obviously came, very well in this book. She writes about, the experience learning to cook beautifully. Her relationship with her husband, Paul Child, was just like so lovely. She puts little letters that he wrote to his brother. What was his name? I can't remember what his brother's name was, but he would write to him about Julia and how she was learning to cook, and it was just really nice to see how he appreciated her tenacity in trying to learn and what she was doing with herself. So yeah, I really liked this, and it made me want to rewatch Julie and Julia. Because that movie was well, obviously this is the movie cover. This is Meryl Streep, not Julia Child. but yeah, it just really made me want to watch that movie again and experience all the wonders of French cooking. Now, the last book that I read, or at this point in time when I'm filming this, I'm still currently reading, because it is actually the end of November. It's actually Thanksgiving Day when I'm filming this. I'm still reading this because this one is the dense one that I'm not enjoying as much, although I do think it's really interesting. And that is Eden's Outcasts by John Mattison. and this won a Pulitzer Prize, and it is about Louisa May Alcott and her father, Bronson Alcott, who was a very prominent figure in the transcendental movement in America. It was kind of the it was the early 1800s, um, and into the 1900s, and it's very interesting. But for the first like 5 chapters of this book, which the chapters are pretty long, it talks more about Bronson, because it's kind of going through his entire life. So Louisa is still a very young child at this, at that time, at like around chapter 5. She's around 10 years old. And while it's very interesting about Bronson, I'm more interested in Louisa. So it's been a little bit of slow goings for me, but it's really interesting to see how Bronson and Louisa end up clashing, and how she just like basically renounces everything that Bronson stood for. And it's just really interesting to see Bronson as a father figure, and how much he loved it, but he almost loved it as a scientific experiment. He was very interested in the raising of children, and how you could, I don't know, make them almost godlike. And he viewed himself as almost godlike. And he tried to form a commune at one point, and I just kind of never really knew that that was a big thing in that time period. I knew about the transcendental movement, but I never really delved into it. In school, I never learned about Bronson Alcott. He was friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau, and a lot of other prominent writers of that time. But I feel like Bronson was, probably because he was a little bit of a Looney Tune, never really got the same recognition as Emerson and Thoreau. I feel like the author of this book kind of makes it clear that Emerson and Thoreau had a little bit more rationale to put the brakes on some of the ideas that Bronson Alcott would throw at them. But yeah, it's a very interesting book, and I'm enjoying it more now that it's getting more into the relationship with Louisa and her father. And yeah, so I'm still in the midst of this book, actually, so I guess it's not fully a wrap up, but this may go a little bit into December. But it also is a library book, and I'm assuming at some point they're not going to let me renew this anymore. So I wanted to get this review out before they tell me, no, you have to bring this book back. You've had it for long enough. But yeah, so those are the 4 books that I read for Nonfiction November. It was a very enjoyable month of reading for me. I was actually pretty surprised that I enjoyed reading what I read. And yeah, I would like to know in the comments, what was your favorite read of Nonfiction November? Or if you didn't actually participate in the readathon, what have you read in the past that's been nonfiction that you've really enjoyed? And if you're not a big nonfiction reader, did it surprise you that you enjoyed it as much as you did? And would you like put it on your list of favorite books? So yeah, I'm just interested to know, because I was really shocked that I enjoyed all these books as much as I did, and actually finished them, aside from the Eden Outcast one that I'm still reading, but I do plan to finish it. So yeah, so that's all I have for you today. And when I'm filming this is Thanksgiving, so I'm going to go put on some stretchy pants and get prepared for all the food I'm going to be eating. And I will talk to you in my next video, which, when you're seeing this, will be Vlogmas. So I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye, friends.